There we are. I think we are live.
You are?
We are live, everybody. Welcome, everybody, to our View from Here. I'm really excited that this finally came together. All of us separately have been doing a lot of promoting for our books lately, since you can't really go into a bookstore and go browsing for shopping. So I thought, what would I like to do rather than just sit and listen to one or two people? I thought I'd like to listen to all of them. So I contacted 5 of my favorite internationally best-selling historical fiction authors and asked them if they would like to be part of a panel with me, and they said yes. So I'm very excited. Today we'll pass it on for other people to talk more about it, but I want to thank all the ladies for coming, and I want to thank all of you for coming to watch us. And feel free to ask questions as we go. Now I'm going to pass it over to Kristin Harmel, who's going to introduce us all.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. And Genevieve, thank you so much for putting it together. We were just saying before this all started, we absolutely would not be here if not for all your hard work. So thank you. It's been mind-boggling the amount that you've done. So thank you so much. So everybody, we are Jennifer Robson, the author of The Gown.
Hi, everybody.
Beautiful cover, love it. Ellen Keith, the author of The Dutch Wife. Wonderful. Hi. Julia Kelly, the author of Whispers of War.
Hi.
Roxanne Veletzos, the author of The Girl They Left Behind.
Hello.
Me, Kristin Harmel, the author of The Winemaker's Wife and the upcoming The Book of Lost Names, which will be out this summer. And most of all, our fearless leader, Genevieve Graham, the author of The Forgotten Home Child, which is for like the billionth week in a row, #1 on the Canadian fiction bestseller list, I believe, right?
Yeah. Yay.
So thank you so much for bringing us all together, Genevieve. And everyone out there, all the links to buy our books are posted in the Facebook Live event page. And Genevieve has also very helpfully posted links to our website there too.
Yep. Yeah, and we are going to be taking questions that we gathered before this event, but we also want to, as you guys are watching live on Facebook, be answering your questions as well. So feel free to leave those in the comments, and we are very excited to tackle some of those good questions.
And on top of that, we're so excited that you're here to join us today, and we really thought that it would be nice to give away a few copies of our books, one from each of us. So if you would like to win one of them, please just leave a comment saying which one you'd like to win, or if you are up for any of them, let us know and we will be mailing them out. And because we're coming to you from different parts of Canada and around the world today, we're asking that we just limit it to recipients in Canada and the US, just so that we can save a little bit on postage costs. And we will let you know tomorrow on our Facebook page who is winning each copy.
All right, so let's get started. Again, we're all so incredibly excited to be here and to have a chance to connect with our wonderful readers. So why don't we start by introducing our books and giving just a short synopsis of what it's about. So I will, why don't we start with Jennifer? For anyone who hasn't read The Gown, tell us what it's all about.
Here it is. So it feels like it's been a while since it's been out, but that's probably because my head's been buried in another book that I've been writing. But The Gown is the story of 2 women who helped to create the beautiful embroidery on Princess Elizabeth's wedding dress in 1947. My characters are fictional, but they're based on, women who I felt plausibly could have been a part of Norman Hartnell's workroom at the time. Their names are Anne and Miriam. We follow them throughout 1947. We watch the year unfold with them, and of course, outside the fairy tale, work of creating a royal wedding gown. London and England are desperately miserable places, and their lives are very difficult. And so it's a respite for them really to come to the workrooms to work on this gown, made out of stardust. There's also a modern day element to the story that picks up with the granddaughter of one of the women. Just a few years ago, and she's seeking answers about her grandmother. And it takes her from Toronto, where she lives, to London, because there's a mystery that she has to unravel about her grandmother's past. So that's the story of the gown. And just the one question that I get asked all the time, which I'm going to answer quickly: did I talk to the Queen when I was making this book? I did not. So sorry. Oh, and now let me move on. I think it's my turn to, who should I introduce next? I'm going to call upon Ellen, I think, to talk about her most recent book.
Right, so my most recent book is also my first book. So The Dutch Wife, as I said. The Dutch Wife is a World War II novel, and it follows the story of a woman in the Dutch resistance, Marijke de Graaf. And she and her husband are arrested for their resistance activities, and they're sent as political prisoners to 2 separate concentration camps in Germany. When she arrives at the women's camp, Ravensbrück, Marijke finds out that she has the opportunity to be rerouted to the camp that her husband is at, but only if she would volunteer to become a voluntary prostitute in a camp brothel that they've set up for the male prisoners in that camp. And so she has to make a very difficult decision. And then it also interweaves another storyline that takes place 30 years later in the 1970s in Argentina. And that follows the story of Luciano Wagner, who's a university student, and he gets caught up amid all of the political upheaval during the military dictatorship that takes over Argentina. And he becomes one of the 30,000 disappeared who become prisoners under this military dictatorship. So it goes back and forth between those 2 storylines, and eventually they connect.
It was a beautiful book.
Yeah, it's a heavy one, but as many of you, I'm very interested in World War II fiction. So next, maybe Genevieve?
Sure. The Forgotten Home Child just came out on March 3rd, so you might have seen it around, but you wouldn't see it inside bookstores. So I'm excited to be able to share it here. The Forgotten Home Child is based on the true story of Canada's British home children, which is a story in our history that we basically don't know anything about. It's a story of 120,000 plus, probably 130,000 is closer to it, destitute children that were sent from the filthy streets of England between 1869 and 1948, and they were off the streets and put into safe shelters, such as Thomas Bernardo was one of the philanthropists that took them in and gave them a roof over their head, gave them food and training and new clothes and everything, took good care of them. But the places ran out of room for the thousands of children that kept flooding in. And so they worked on putting together an emigration scheme between the Canadian government, the British government, and these organizations that took the children in. And they basically sold indenture contracts of the children to the Canadians overseas. So the idea was to give the kids a good life, get them off the dirty, filthy streets, clean up London and give the people a better city overall, and help the Canadians who were much in need of workers. But the truth was that once they got over here, there were no checks and balances in place. And of all those children, about 25% of them had a good life out here, were taken in by good families, and about 75% faced extreme neglect and abuse and even death at times at the hands of their masters and mistresses. And so I weave the story of 5 children who are all made out of, I sent out surveys to some of the descendants, and everything they told me about what they remembered got woven into the characters of these children. So it's basically a true story made out of bits and pieces of real children. So it's and just like Jennifer, there's a dual timeline. So I have a present tense as well, because the main character, Winnie, is also talking. She's finally telling her secret life after, well, she's 97 years old, and her granddaughter and great grandson finally want to hear the truth from her, and so that's where they come together. So that's basically the story. Bring a box of Kleenex. I'm going to pass it over to Kristin. Do you want to talk about The Winemaker's Daughter or your new book? Or?
Oh, yeah, I'll tell you a little bit about the Winemaker's Wife. which came out last summer in hardcover and in Canada. And it just came out in paperback last month in the United States. And I had a whole book tour planned, but it actually came out March 17th, which, if you all remember, March 17th was the beginning of when they were telling us, don't go anywhere. So that all quickly vanished. If you need to bring a box of tissues to Genevieve's book, you need to just bring a bottle of champagne to mine. Also a few tissues, but I like to drown my sorrows in champagne rather than tissues if possible. So, so The Winemaker's Wife is also a dual timeline story. It's set in the Champagne region of France, and two of the characters are in World War II, in the World War II time period, and one is in the present day. And it's sort of just this tale of love, loss, resistance, betrayal, of course, champagne. And it centers on the French resistance in the past. So fans of Ellen's book might be interested to read a little bit about the resistance in France. But it also talks about how the resistance unfolded in the Champagne region, which was such a fascinating thing for me to find out about. Because I mean, personally, I've always associated champagne, you know, with joy and celebration and all those things. It's just this fizzy, bubbly, you know, wonderful drink. But it is actually, I've read a quote that said more blood has been spilled on the fields of Champagne than anywhere else in the world. Like if you add up sort of all the wars that have taken place there. So that's sort of interesting. I thought that contrast was interesting, but it was actually quite a hotbed of resistance during World War II. So this book is about a woman in the present day finding out about her past and how it relates to this fictional champagne house during World War II. And how about Julia? I would love to hear about your new book.
So I feel like I'm in very good company because I do love a dual timeline book, and I also love a book about kind of a bit of a forgotten history or a very little known history. So that is all of this book as well. The Whispers of War is my second historical World War II book. The first is The Light Over London. So in The Whispers of War, we meet three best friends who all went to boarding school together, sort of making it in London. They do different things in their life. But when war strikes, it hits this group of friends particularly hard because one of them is actually a German expat who's living in London. She's lived there since she was a preteen, and she doesn't really know any other home but London. But suddenly, it becomes a very uncomfortable place to be. She's labeled an enemy alien and forced to register, forced to go through a tribunal process to see whether she'll be interned or not. And so, as the war goes on, the pressure keeps being applied on her and on her friends, and they're forced to make some really difficult decisions about what does loyalty mean to their friendship, what does the loyalty mean to their country, what are they willing to do in order to keep their friend free of an internment camp, with a couple of twists and turns along the way. And this story is interwoven with a present day story of a woman being given a bequest, basically, when her grandmother passes away, to go back to England and sort of reunite one of these women with some documents and some things that are significant to their story. So it's a way of kind of revealing a bit of that family secret, while also hopefully bringing people along for a bit of that history that they might not know about.
I loved your secondary characters. They were so much fun.
Oh, thank you so much. And Roxanne, I think we need to hear about your book as well.
So The Girl They Left Behind is also my debut novel. It came out last year, late 2018. And it is, you know, for me, a deeply, deeply personal story because it is based on my mother's life and, in fact, her childhood, her true life experience. As a toddler, she was abandoned on the steps of an apartment building in Bucharest in January of 1941. In the middle of a terrible wave of violence against the Jewish population, which later became known as the Bucharest pogrom. And, you know, as I was growing up, at first in Bucharest, where the story takes place, and later in California, I became a little bit obsessed. I couldn't really stop thinking about what might have really happened with this couple, because unlike in the book, in real life, she was really never able to reconnect with her biological family. And so from this point sort of stemmed this story, which is, as I said, in large part based on reality, especially concerning the early events of her life and her adoption, but then sort of spins off into several directions and sort of weaves fact and fiction, and you know, ending with you know, what I think is a pretty interesting portrayal of what happened in Romania during the years of the Iron Curtain. So that's it for me.
That's awesome.
Wonderful.
We have some questions already. So hang on one second.
Great. Thanks, everyone. Keep asking your questions. We love getting them from readers. Everyone's book sounds so good. My reading list has just extended. Some of you I've read
always.
I haven't, but they all sound so good.
Okay, so the first one we have is Megan Mayer. She says, I have a question. How do you go about researching a location in time in order to convey a strong sense of place and do it justice? I'm writing a book set in Glasgow during World War II and feel like I'm having to make up a lot about the general feel and atmosphere due to being unable to find much online and in books about it. So who wants to start that?
I can start that one if you like, because I live in London and I write about London, but even before then had a strong connection to this place. Glasgow is actually a really interesting area during the war. It was heavily bombed. There was a lot of movement of people. And I know just from readers who've reached out to me who were from Glasgow and were actually evacuated as children, there's still a lot of firsthand accounts. So you may be able to sort of go through something, there's a project from the BBC called The People's World War II. So you can actually go in and take a look at what people have told interviewers or actually recordings that they've done. And you can search them by location and actually find first-person accounts from the city of Glasgow and get a sense of what it was that people were going through, how they lived, what they were doing. Some is just sort of slice of life, and some gets very detailed into sort of if somebody was an air raid warden, they'll talk about what they did during the war as an air raid warden. So that can be a really great way of accessing a bit of detail that wouldn't normally come through in history books.
Wow, that's neat.
Yeah.
Great. I think this might have something to do with Kirsten's, because with Kirsten's book, because it says, is it too early for happy hour? We should have probably brought some.
It's not too early here.
Yeah, it's dinner time, so it would work really well.
I'm 10 a.m. California, and despite all the current chaos, the go-to drink for the hour is still coffee. Although I'd love to.
I've got one from Joy Kelly Mills, and she says, to what do you place the current fascination with historical fiction? It seems to be so popular lately, which is great, she says. That's a good question. Who would like to start?
I guess I'll jump in quickly and say, I mean, I've always read historical fiction. I maybe it's getting a certain amount of preeminence above and beyond some other genres, which is really nice if like all of us, that's the genre you write in. I think it's the ultimate escapist fiction. It just, to me, even if I'm reading about something that's a time that's extraordinarily difficult, you know, the Blitz and the book previous to this last one that I wrote called Good Night from London, you know, it was harrowing to research at times. People really struggled and suffered, but it's so inspiring to read about how they carried on. And that's what I've been turning to again and again over the last while. I mean, to be honest, I should just have been focused on my own book, but I really hope my editor isn't listening to this. But you know, that's what I've been turning to is historical fiction, because it's an escape. It's the ultimate escape. And even if the characters are going through difficult times, you can admire them for their fortitude, for their courage. That's I think that's what many really millions of readers are responding to right now.
Yeah, and I think people are looking to learn. I think with historical fiction, we can take the black and white of history and we can add color to it, and it can reach it can reach your head and your heart at the same time. And I think that's really filling a lot of readers that are craving something a little bit more, a little outside of what's happening right now. That's what I think.
I've also found, particularly in relation to writing about World War II, writing about that general time period, that readers today really feel a connection to that time period, because most of us had either parents or grandparents who lived through that time period and had an experience during that time period. And I think that was people 75 years ago, I think, didn't necessarily talk about their hardships and talk about their feelings with future generations the way that we might be doing. You know, like we all talk about things now. I don't think that was the thing for that generation. So many of us have lost the people that we love who lived through that. And to me, as a reader and as a writer, reading about World War II is sort of a way to connect with those people we love and maybe have lost.
Yeah, definitely. If I can add, you know, there's so many accounts when you hear of grandparents who, or at least for our generation, that weren't able to really speak about what happened during the war. And that's not necessarily just involving the Holocaust, but the entire war experience, you know, because it was so traumatic for them. And so I think, you know, to some extent, they wanted to not only, you know, sort of shield the ones they love from these stories, but in a sense to forget in order to get on with your life. And so I think that finally, after all these years, we have this, you know, all these stories that are sort of coming in and are finally sort of, you know, people are opening up. People who actually lived through those experiences are able to open up. And so that's why we have sort of like this new wave or renaissance of historical fiction, which is wonderful to see.
Mm-hmm. We have so many questions. You guys, it's funny. Piper is typing her little fingers off trying to keep up to everything.
Great.
There's one specifically for Roxanne from Kim Whalen asking, what was your mom's reaction to the fictional parts of your book?
That's an interesting question. So I really sort of fluctuated between, should I share this book as I'm writing it with her in pieces, or should I wait till the very end? And I actually decided to wait till the very end because, interestingly enough, as I was writing the story, obviously I had, you know, the platform of her life, which is all definitely captured in the pages of the book. But at some point, you know, Natalia, for me, who was based on my mother, kind of became her own person. She took on a life of her own. And I actually think this is a very good thing, because at some point I needed to see her as a character in her own right and not necessarily as my mother. But inherent in that came, you know, more or less a different path for Natalia, which maybe necessarily would not have been the right path for my mom. I mean, she as a character, as she evolved, kind of started to make her own decisions and you know, again, just came to life on a page as someone separate than my mother. And so I think there were certainly you know, several elements of the plot line, primarily the romance that never really existed in real life, which I think kind of shocked my mother. But I think in the end, she too recognizes that it, you know, really enriched the story, and that a novel is really just a novel. You know, it is really a blend of, you know, life and fiction, and that fictional part was really important for me to thread in the pages of the book. So thanks for that question, Kim.
All right, one from Megan Redmile, who I know is also a historical fiction author. Choosing a subject or storyline, how do you come up with it? Is it something you stumble upon while you're researching? Is it based on family stories? You don't count for this one, Roxanne, because we already heard.
How to choose a title? Is that what the question that
For everyone else, I think we're looking for where do you get your inspiration? Where do you find your subjects in your stories? So,
got it. So, you know, definitely for The Girl Left Behind, I had the material sort of, you know, in, I don't want to say my back pocket, but it was really inherent in my early life. I mean, I grew up with these stories that I knew about my mother, and also my grandparents, Anton and Delfina, who also play a huge part in the book. I think for me, I try and draw on, you know, I mean, they always say, write what you know. And for me, I really try and draw on my experiences of, you know, living in Eastern Europe, in Bucharest as a child. You know, that was, you know, such an interesting and disturbing time. It was actually, my family and I left Romania in the final years of the Iron Curtain. So I actually got to experience as a child a little bit of what it was like to live in that time, you know, with the streets engulfed in darkness and the food lines and, you know, rationed electricity. And, you know, even though I only experienced these things as a child, they really sunk deeply into my psyche. And I felt that it was important for me to actually portray that slice of reality, excuse me, that I got to experience. With my second novel, I'm also drawing quite a bit on my early experiences of living in Eastern Europe, even though this second novel takes place in a different country. But I think, I'm sorry, this is probably a very long answer, but really kind of look inward and draw on what you know. If there's a culture that fascinates you, absolutely write about it. If there's a culture that you're familiar with, if you're, you know, an expat, or if you've, you know, you were an immigrant child like I was. I mean, these are very deep experiences that I think we all as humans can relate to and really enjoy reading because they enrich our lives.
Right. How about
Can
you?
I add something to that?
Yeah.
I think in my case, I had almost the opposite, where the idea for my book greatly evolved because of something I stumbled across partway through. I initially started writing thinking that I really wanted to focus on creating the character of an SS officer and trying to get into his mindset through the connections he has with other people. And while trying to figure out what kind of women I could put him in contact with in the context of being in a camp, I ended up stumbling across the existence of these camp brothels that were set up for prisoners. And the idea that it was set up for the camp prisoners instead of for the officers was such a startling realization for me that it ended up kind of taking control of the whole story. And the story really evolved from there. And I think in general, I really find that can be such a good source of inspiration. I find so often if I'm reading the news or something, there'll be some really quirky headline that jumps out and I really just have to bookmark it, and it goes in my inspiration folder on my bookmarks tab. And there's always these really strange tidbits that you can come back to and draw on when you're looking for something to weave into stories later on.
Yeah, I feel a little bit like being a historical author is like being a sponge. You read and you watch things and you listen to people tell stories. And the moment that well, in my experience, the moment I started telling people I'm writing about World War II, it was like opening the floodgates of everybody's family story, which I love. It makes me incredibly happy to hear what people's personal experience was, because I think it is so personal still when you have family members who either are still alive or have recently passed. And so having that just sort of all in somewhere in the back of my brain, and then every once in a while I'll need to pitch a book and I'll kind of start pulling ideas, and one thing will lead to another thing, and it really helps to kind of solidify an idea. But it tends to be not one, for me at least, it tends to not be one, you know, moment of inspiration. It's a whole bunch of different things that I picked up along the way that come together at the right time.
And I think that's kind of the cool thing about writing historical fiction is that you're not necessarily following a path that's entirely been set out for you. You do have that artistic freedom to be able to combine different stories and different inspirations. Like for the Book of Lost Names, the one that's coming out this summer, I knew I wanted to write about document forgers in World War II, but the story just wasn't complete yet. Like it needed something else. And then my agent sent me a story from the New York Times about the Nazi looting of books at the end of the war, toward the end of the war. And I knew the second she sent it, I thought that's the framework. And so that's what it is. It's framed by the story of a lost book, which is the Book of Lost Names. And the story that takes place in the past is mostly about the document forgery, but it needed that framing. So I think just anything that's an interesting story that captures your attention, that captures your imagination, to me is worth exploring as a topic to write about.
Yeah. What about you, Jennifer? Where'd the gown come from?
Oh, desperation.
That's also a great
Might as well be
motivator.
honest. You know, I've been working on another book for probably about 6 months. You know, after I'd finished Goodnight from London, and it wasn't hanging together. The characters weren't talking to me, which is a thing. I like hands up whose characters start talking to them by the end of, you know, work on a book. I know my family thinks I'm completely batty, but it does happen. But so it wasn't coming together. And so then that's when I kind of hit the panic button and sat down with my editor and my agent, and we just kind of went back to square one, in the sense of them kind of throwing questions at me, and me putting on my history nerd hat, and thinking, okay, what do I really want to write about? And I think before with the earlier idea, I just let myself get pulled along by an idea that was interesting but didn't captivate me. And if an idea doesn't captivate you, you're not going to live through the months that you spend researching it, the months you spend writing it, and then the year or so that you have to talk about it when you go on tour, either, well, in the good old days, going places, or now, talking to people from the comfort of your living room. And so with the gown, it was kind of this, really over the course of one discussion, it was, what did I want to talk about? I wanted to talk about post-war Britain, and what a difficult time it was, and how I felt that it gets skipped over. We go straight from VE Day and kind of the popular imagination, whoop, and suddenly it's the 1950s, but this, again, not an accurate representation of the 1950s. It's day glow, kind of poodle skirts, big Oldsmobiles, which is really an Americanized fantasy of the 1950s. And all that decade in between of real hardship globally, we miss. And that's what I wanted to talk about. But I also realized, does anybody really want 400 pages of very indigestible post-war rationing and austerity? That's a tall order for readers to accept. And so I needed the contrast. And in the Royal Wedding, I found the contrast. And it was the point where real life and royal fantasy connected that I found the story. But it wasn't, I'm making it sound like 1, 2, 3. There was a lot of back and forth, and me talking to myself as I walk the dog, which I'm sure my neighbors find alarming, but it does the trick. It does the trick eventually.
Yeah, it's they come out of nowhere, these ideas.
Yeah.
I know that when I found the story about the British home children, I was not looking for it. I just kind of always am looking for something in Canadian history that's going to grab me. And there's a lot of interesting stories that we haven't heard of, but they don't all grab me. And that one, that just hooked me right away. And how can we not know about so many children that were here, that were basically helping to build this country, and we don't know, and we're not taught. So to me, there was never any question of if I was going to write it. I had to write it. So I'm just going to move on to, we're trying to keep up here. Piper's typing up the questions. She's summarizing because there's a lot of repeats.
By the way, I wanted to say, after reading your book, it was honestly so fascinating, and something that I knew virtually nothing about. And it was really so interesting to me that I ended up doing offline research just to find out more about, their true story and sort of what happened with this group of children. And, I'm sure I probably stumbled upon a lot of the research material that you used in your novel, but it was really, that fascinating and sort of shocking. And, I think that, as you said, we all needed to become aware of. So thank you for writing that book.
It's, to me, it was fascinating because, what happened was the children felt so terrible about themselves that they never really admitted to people who they were. But now the genealogy is so accessible and everybody's online doing it, they've discovered that 12% of Canada's population is descended from the children. So that's over 4 million people.
Oh, wow.
No idea that they are related to
That's
anything.
incredible.
It's a pretty eye-opening story, and I did a lot of crying while I was writing it, but
I know, but my kids will come up sometimes when I'm working, especially the final stages of the book, when I'm just really intense, and they'll come in and say, "Are you okay, Mom? Why are you crying?" And I'll just, and I have to admit I've done something terrible to one of my characters, and I feel really badly about it, but they still have to die.
Yeah.
Yeah. Can you tell I'm almost done the manuscript of another book? I'm just on that edge of just being too loopy to be able to sit down and write and concentrate.
the community myself this time because usually I work in complete silence. I don't know if you guys work with music or with anything, but I picked this one soundtrack that it was just a crier the whole time. So I was bawling already, and then I turned on the sad music. But do you guys work in silence, or what's your go-to?
I make soundtracks for all my characters. So if I'm writing for multiple narrators and then I need to get inspired, then I'll put on the soundtrack that is kind of in line with what I think they would have been listening to.
I love that.
Brilliant.
Wonderful. That's a great idea.
Yeah, add that to your to-do list. That's
Yes.
do we travel to a location to do on-site research? Kimberly asks. Who does traveling? I don't.
Yeah, I do. Yeah.
I walk down the road. It's not bad. I live where I write. So no, I'm pretty lucky. So the book that I'm I don't think I can talk about yet. For 2021, I did do a tiny bit of traveling, but it was very conveniently located to a place I go to a lot anyway, which is very helpful and not very tax deductible. So, but no, I've been lucky. Most of where I've written things I've written about in London, I've been able to walk to and wander around, and they're sort of familiar enough.
Mm-hmm. I've made a point, over the years of the one thing that I will spend money on is the travel. And I'm fortunate. I mean, I'll say that off the bat that I've been able to do it. It was harder when my kids were little. It was a bit of a head scratcher how to manage these trips. But I feel for me, and I don't think you have to travel to be. I don't think. Yeah, I don't want anyone who's an aspiring writer to think, oh man, if I can't, especially now, make it to Paris and walk around, then I can't do it. You absolutely can. But for me, and it's an indulgence, I really want to be able to walk along the streets where my characters walked, and I want to look for all the little details that they might have noticed. My book that I've just finished is set almost entirely in Italy, in a not very well traveled, at least by foreigners, part of the country, near Monte Grappa in the Veneto region. And the reason I'm writing about it is because it's where my husband's family is from. And I found the story through their family history. And we've been there any number of times, but I had to go back so that I could see the places I was writing about, not through my eyes, but through the eyes of Antonina, my main character. And I mean, the fact that Venice is one of the settings was such a terrible hardship for me to have to drag myself over in January. I mean, I'm lucky that we were there really just before, travel became very, very difficult. But if anyone's wondering, again, do I have to travel? You don't. And for the one tool that I have made a lot of use of over the years, it's kind of a combined tool of Google Street View to walk myself through the streets. But yeah, you also need contemporary maps so that you can see, especially if you're talking about the Second World War. And I know all of us here, are familiar with this. You can't be certain that the street you're walking down necessarily ran in the same path or looked at all the same as it did when your characters were there. And I actually have an amazing tool that I've used. This only applies if you're writing books set in England and England and a little bit of Scotland, but I'll post it. I'll add it to the comments, where it's actually a layered map that you can find a place, even an address in London, a small neighborhood, and you can see the maps overlaid on one another since I think the earliest maps are probably from the 1850s up to modern day ones. And you can see how the neighborhood has changed. And some of the maps are so detailed, they include descriptions of where there's a pub, a post office, all the hospitals. It has been invaluable. So I am absolutely I'm writing a note to myself, put that address up so other people can use it, because and it's the National Libraries of Scotland. I think somebody probably did it for a master's degree program, and wherever they are, I'm eternally grateful to them.
Oh, I'm going to grab that. I used to have that for New York City, but I don't have that for London. So this is very exciting.
Yeah, no, I will make sure you get it, Julia. I'm just looking for, you think I'd have in my writer's office a pen and a piece of paper?
Yeah, travel's been really important for me also, but I agree with you, Jennifer, that you don't have to if you're early, especially if you're early in your writing career, or if you have young children. I have a 4-year-old, so it's difficult for me to travel right now. I feel I had to travel for The Winemaker's Wife when he was about 2, and it was the hardest thing I've ever done. It was my first time. It was my first time leaving him. And to leave him and go across an ocean was just, I felt like I'd ripped my heart out and left it behind with him. But on that trip, there were things I discovered that were absolutely crucial to the book. I went because I kept putting it off and putting it off and putting it off for as long as I possibly could. I went 2 weeks before the book was due. To fill in all the gaps in my research, because I knew there were things, and I've lived in Paris. That it was my 4th book written set in World War II France, so I was familiar with all of that. But I needed to walk the streets of Champagne again, of the Champagne region, and there were things I found out that changed minor plot points, and I would not have found them out if I didn't travel for it. So I think if you can't travel for whatever reason, do your best to read memoirs of people who lived there during the time period you're writing about. I do find sometimes that memoirs that are just self-published on Amazon sometimes can contain details that might have been edited out in a more professional version. You know what I mean? So I kind of try to get my hands on everything I can, because, you might find somebody going on for 3 pages about how the daffodils smelled a particular time of the year, and you're like, oh, there were daffodils that time of year, and then you want to independently verify it. But I don't know, I find that those things are really helpful, hearing people's thoughts from those places, from those time periods, in their own voices.
Definitely.
Carolyn McIsaac says, I'd like to know, if it's a fiction book, do you start with a notebook and jot down the names and hair color and eyes, and how do you keep track of all those things with your characters?
If I was smart, I'd do that. I tend to leave it to a later draft when I realize I've changed everybody's hair color and I can't remember their eye color or whether they're short or tall. And then my copy editor gets very cross with me. So I am learning with every book, but I'm now 10 books in, so you'd think I would have learned a little bit more by this point. So yeah.
I do character sketches, just with the details, and then I also answer Proust questionnaires for not all the characters, but the central characters, and also not all the questions on the original questionnaire is incredibly long. But I find it's really handy if I can figure out what does, answer the question, like what scares you the most, or what's your happiest memory through the viewpoint of my central characters, then I feel like I'm close enough to them that I can start writing about them, if that makes any sense.
That'd be fascinating.
I do that as well. And I also go online and I'll Google search images for actors or people that either were from that time period or that I have a certain look in mind. And then I'll pin those to the board with the character sketch so that I have a really clear visual to kind of go off. And of course, that person, their face changes in your mind, and it's not the specific individual that you have pinned, but it becomes a bit of a blend. And it just helps me to sort of get an initial feeling of what that person is like and make them a little more 3-dimensional.
And how much time, they're wanting to know, how much time you put into research? I know for me, it's 50-50. I write really fast. So if it takes me 8 months to write a book, then it's 50-50. I do a lot of the basic stuff ahead of time. Again, the black and white history, I do all that so I'm grounded, and then I get into the details, and that's when my characters kind of tell me what they need to know. So that's when my research works it in. So it's 50-50 for me. What do you guys think?
I think it really depends on, what the nature of your stories. If you're writing about, very difficult or convoluted or complex, period of time, such as, Romania, for example, in World War II, not only was it somewhat unknown, but, it really does have just an uber complicated history. There were so many changing factions and, dueling for power. And I mean, like truly would make a wonderful modern day or whatever, Game of Thrones. And so sometimes as you're writing your book, you also don't want to get so bogged down in these details because it becomes almost like a history book. So in that sense, you have to kind of just really, become so familiar with these events so that they can more naturally kind of thread through the personal story or the plot line. And so that may actually sound counterintuitive. I think in a situation like that, you want to do more research than less research. And so like with The Girl That Left Behind, after spending 2 months with my mom, really interviewing her when I decided to write this book and thinking that I knew already quite a bit about Romania since it's my native country, I found out that I knew virtually nothing. And then I took literally a year to do research for it before I felt comfortable enough to tackle all these like quickly moving events and factions.
I think for me, two of the most important lessons that people have passed on to me about doing research for historical fiction is, first of all, don't try to do all the research up front, because you will just disappear down into the Wikipedia spiral of, one thing leads to another, and it then becomes really hard to actually get to the writing part, because you always will find that there's more that you're missing. So I will go through, and if there's, a certain detail in the course of writing a scene that I feel I'm missing that is essential to the functioning of the scene, I will sometimes just highlight it and leave a note and say, you need to research this part. Because otherwise I've had days where I end up spending 3 hours just on an internet rampage searching for things. And the other thing, just what you just said, Roxanne, about the details overwhelming things, I've heard so many times, especially from my mother, that she'll be reading a book and she'll say, yeah, and suddenly there was 2 pages that just seemed like the writer trying to show off how much they knew about the time period. And so in later drafts, that's really important, I think, for me to try to go back and find the spots where I added something in just because I thought it was such a neat fact that it's not actually really essential, but to try to tone that down a little bit.
Yeah, it's not like it's overwriting. It's just that we find it so exciting at the time. And the only way I've found it, going back to some of my earlier books, I can find it more, but I have to read it out loud. And then I go, oh, geez, I should. Or once in a while, I'll listen to one of the audiobooks and I'll go, oh, this is really dragging out. You could have just kept that one quiet. There's a lot of stuff that you're right. I'm sure you guys do the same thing. I write tons of extra stuff that just doesn't fit at all, but I delete it. I've used some of it in other books when it called for it. Do you do that?
Never throw anything out. I mean, even if you just get one sentence out of 10,000 words that you've had to check aside, that one sentence is worth something to you. And I mean, once it's gone, it's gone. I mean, now I would sooner put a fork in my eye than let people see some of the stuff that's been excised from my books. It'd be mortifying, but it still lives on my on my laptop, buried away, because again, you never know, like you might end up going back to the same period, the same setting, and need to describe, I don't know, the entrance to a stately hall that you pulled because it was extraneous, but there it is, and you don't have to go to the trouble. I mean, not that it's unpleasant, spending some time noodling around, just, getting a sense of what a particular stately hall would look like. I've never done that, of course. But, there's always, you never want to throw away your hard work. And I have friends who are writers who toss stuff out all the time. And I just want to say, don't do it. Just, you don't have to show it to anyone, but don't throw away your time.
I've actually ended up with a few different short stories that way that I've been able to send out as sort of newsletter bonus content, thank yous to people for reading the book, things like that. Because I don't do character sketches beforehand, I tend to write my way through some of the character elements, and sometimes they'll go off on a lovely tangent that tells me so much about who they are and is just not necessary for the book. So pulling that out can be quite painful, but it has meant that I've been able to kind of recraft things and repurpose some of that content and get some use out of it, which is really helpful. And I think it's fun for me, and it seems to be, based on the feedback I'm getting, fun for readers also to have a little bit of a check back in with characters and see how they're doing, or get this, something was mentioned in the book that originally had been a full scene, and I can bring that scene back and give them a bit of a behind the scenes look at what was going on.
Yeah, and Susan Seligman just asked this pertinent
Hi,
question
Susan.
about author notes at the end. You guys all do those, right?
Oh, yes.
I was actually just about to say an author's note is a perfect place to put
Yeah.
some of that, some of those very interesting things you've come across that don't fit somewhere in the book. Or if you're only able to fit a tiny bit of it in the book, the author's note is just the perfect place to go into a little bit more depth. And I will tell you, I think half the feedback I get from readers is about the author's note, is about, I loved your story, but I was so fascinated to read, to read where it came from, or to read the real story behind the story, or to find out that this character was real and this one wasn't. And I just think, particularly when we're writing historical fiction, giving people that background is crucial. It's almost like giving them an insight as to what you would tell them on a book tour if you're not able to actually meet them on a book tour.
Yeah. And just the delicious chance to nerd out. I mean, it has to, like, I'm always holding it at bay when I'm writing the actual book. And then I can just, to the degree to which my lovely publishers will indulge me in terms of how many pages I have at the end of the book, I go to that very last page, I'll tell you, because it's just, it's so fun. It's so fun. And I guess I'm a shameless nerd about it. And luckily other people seem to like reading those notes.
They do.
For sure. Okay, let's move into, like, today with everything that's going on. How is everybody dealing with writing during all of this? Being self-isolated in that. Is it harder? Are you having any trouble, or what's going on?
I've been on deadline, so I don't have a choice.
Yeah.
Oh,
I had to
Better than me, Julia, because I've been on deadline and it still hasn't sped me up. And the number of apology emails that I've sent to my wonderful, very patient, very understanding editor I'm the person who never handed in anything late through, all through university, graduate school, and beyond. I was, the super keener who handed things in on time, and this knocked me for no good reason. Just, my family, we're totally fine. I can't justifiably use this as an excuse, but I let myself get caught up in things like baking sourdough.
Totally.
You know what I've discovered though? It's like having an extra pet in the house that you have to take care of. Yes. It's that level of anxiety, so I may have to give away my sourdough starter to someone else and just set it free, because it's too much right now.
It's a really fattening pet though. I used to have one growing up. You can't stop baking with that.
Oh my goodness.
I think it differs. I'm sort of hearing, families who have children and families who don't have children. And, within my own life, I have many friends who are, basically saying my life isn't really all that different. Even my sister, who doesn't have a child. Well, it's definitely challenging from a work perspective and business wise, but, all in all, it's not, it's not a different reality. And I think having children is sort of like the differentiating factor, because we as parents now have to homeschool our kids and make sure they're getting through their classes and communicating with teachers who are, by the way, doing a phenomenal job. I have no idea how they are able to adapt to this new environment and still teach our children and actually still do a really good job at it. So, but it has altered things without a question. And then once you throw in a husband who works from home as well, things become even more complicated. But anyway, it's been an interesting time.
My kids are all grown up, so they are living here now, but they're in university and they can pretty much look after themselves most of the time. But I find, for me, I'm spending way more time with promotions than I ever do. And that's exhausting. That takes me off course. But what I found about the writing was I haven't really had a problem writing, but my scenes are coming at me like they've never come before, at least out of the blue. Like the one I'm working on right now, I started off writing the first 2 chapters, and then all of a sudden I woke up the next day and wrote the second last chapter. And that's never happened to me before, but I guess it's feeling disconnected, a little disjointed, just like the rest of the world, I think. That's explain it, but
Kristin, how are you managing with a 4-year-old and writing? Like,
I'm hanging on by a thread, I will tell you. And there's just one of him. I don't even know how. I would have lost my mind if I had more than one young child right now. I don't know how people are doing it. I had it down to a science. I mean, my writing schedule was already so compressed because of him. But he was in preschool 15 hours a week, and those were my solid 15 hours of writing time. Like, don't check your email, don't check your Facebook. Like, that is your time to write. But, you know, plus Saturdays. That was kind of my schedule, and now that's all out the window. You know, and some of my friends have said, well, can't you just write for an hour in the evening or an hour in the morning? Well, like, no, that's not how it works. I mean, at least with me, it's not. And so, yeah, my days are about building Lego sets and, you know, figuring out what we're going to do to burn some steam off. And, you know, the days that I have to spend time, you know, emailing people back or doing things like that, and I'm not 100% focusing on him, you can see it in his behavior, because this is so weird for him. And I think 4 is an age when it's so hard to process. Anyways, long answer to a short question. Jennifer, thank you for asking. But yeah, I'm struggling, but it's okay. I've got a book due in November, and it's going to get done.
We'll get done.
It'll get done.
we have reached the end of the hour. I don't know if you want to keep chatting or if you want to, you probably should get back to work.
I have to hand in my manuscript tomorrow.
Oh gosh.
Oh wow. Okay.
It's fine. It's fine. It's all fine. It's totally fine. It's fine. It's fine. No, I'm almost there. It's just, and in fact, like, this is actually watching, like, looking at how productive everyone is and listening to all your amazing stories. It's just, it'll put a spring in my step, as it were, when I turn back to the book that has taken me months longer than usual to finish.
But it's going to be incredible. It's going to be so good.
You will feel amazing turning it in.
I think I'm just going to want to sleep, to be honest. And,
That's amazing.
Yeah. And then clean up the house, because with 2 teenagers and my husband and all these animals we have at home, it looks, my mom's, she had a saying that when the house was messy, she said it looked like Edinburgh after Flodden. And which I've had to explain to non-history nerds a few times, but that's what my house looks like right now. Or like a mini tornado just went through it. Either one will do.
Then we should all get back to work, but I really appreciate you guys doing this with me today. And I know, wait till you see all the comments that have come up. People have really been enjoying listening to all of your stories, your wisdom and learning and all that. So maybe we'll have to do it again sometime.
Yeah.
I love that.
Genevieve, thank you for putting this together. This was really wonderful. It was such a nice break.
Thank you.
And thanks to everyone out there who joined us. What a wonderful thing to have you all show up in the middle of the day and see us. This is great. Or in the evening, as the case may be, to join us.
It is being recorded, so you'll be able to watch it. If you didn't get to see the whole thing live, it takes a little while to download, I think. But it should be there for whenever you want to see it again. And it'll be on everybody's page once I can figure all that out too. I'm better at writing fiction than I am at tech, but I'll get it done. So thank you again. Thank you.
And one more thing. So tomorrow we will be doing the giveaways. So if you haven't commented yet and there's a book that you're wanting to receive, then let us know.
And make sure you write down which book it is. You can write down if there's all 6 of them, that's fine. But if you already own one of them, you can't win that one again. So or which 6 you would like, and we'll put you in, and we'll announce the winner tomorrow, as Ellen said. All right. Well, thank you again. Everybody have a good day.
Hope everyone's safe and well.
Great to meet you all, and thank you again, Genevieve. It was wonderful.
Yeah, thank you, and good luck, Jennifer.
Look, yes.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.